All right, so welcome to the keynote presentation of Dieter Fox. Let me give you some background in case you don't know him. Dieter completed his PhD in 1998 in his hometown University of Bonn, spent 2 years as a postdoc at CMU, and then joined the University of Washington, where he's now a professor of computer science, the director of the UW Robotics and State Estimation Lab, and where from 2009 to 2011, he was director of the Intel Research Labs Seattle. Dieter has more than 150 publications. They've been cited more than 40,000 times, a couple of dozen just by me alone. Among those, you'll find the Probabilistic Robotics book and the Museum Tour Guide paper. I think those are two publications that changed the way a lot of roboticists think about robotics. Certainly it changed the way I think about robotics, and it ushered in what is now a new generation, if not a new paradigm, of probabilistic robotics. The museum guide paper has been named as one of the IIII classic papers very recently, and he's won a number of other best paper awards that I won't list now due to time. Dieter's influence in robotics is more than just his publications. He's been a senior editor for the Transactions on Robotics, PC chair for RSS and IIII. He's on the advisory boards for the Journal of AI Research and also for RSS. He's a fellow of IIII, a fellow of the IEEE. It's been a pleasure for me to work with him in the past, to learn stuff from him, and now it's my pleasure to introduce him to you. This is Dieter Fox.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everybody, for coming and even being on time. What I want to talk about today is kind of give you an overview of some of the work we've been doing in my lab using depth cameras for kind of 3D modeling of objects and for tracking environments. And the ultimate goal of this work is really being able to track and explain every single motion that is going on in a scene and also track every single activity that's going on in the scene. Of course, that's a more long-term goal, but it's kind of what's driving the work we are doing. And kind of as an example application domain, imagine you have a robot in a biology wet lab where you want to do kind of procedures, experimental protocols, like working with pipettes and test tubes. And I think a natural way how you would like to interact with such a robot is just being able to tell it like what the objects look like this is a test tube over here. And then you want to also be able to demonstrate to the robot how it should, for example, move or shake one of these test tubes. It turns out actually in these, that's an important point that you do this the right way. And then finally also you want to then be able to execute these tasks alongside the robot and do it interactively with the robot. And I think there are many different aspects to enable this kind of work. On the one hand side, obviously, if you look at the text here, there's a lot of natural language understanding involved in this. We've done quite some work in that domain, but I'll just point you at the papers that Cynthia has published in this area. Today I want to focus more on the recognition and tracking side of that work. And you can imagine if you want to have a robot that can do these kind of things, I think the robot should be able to recognize all these objects. It needs to be able to track them very accurately, not just kind of with a bounding box. It needs to be able to also track the human interacting with the robot. Where is the person looking? What is the current task going on so that the robot can really interact with the person in a meaningful way. Obviously, this kind of work on visual recognition and tracking gets a lot of attention in the computer vision community. So here I just want to give you some examples of the kind of flavor of the work that's going on there. On the upper left, you see kind of an evaluation on the famous Kitty tracking data set, where the goal is to track all the cars in the environment and people and bicyclists with very obvious applications these days. It's pretty amazing how good these techniques have really gotten over the last year. So especially also maintaining tracks in different lighting conditions and being able to deal with occlusions. But at the same time, if you look at this, it's not really directly applicable to the kind of settings we have in mind, because tracking objects at the bounding box level is not sufficient. We want to really know the 6D pose of an object or the articulation of a human hand. Then there's work, of course, especially by the Microsoft research team, where they do some amazing work on tracking hands. The limitation here is it's pretty specialized to the kind of application domains they have in mind, and it's not readily clear how we can apply that directly in robotic setting. And moving upwards a bit, talking about activities, there's of course a lot of work under the domain called action recognition, where the idea is you get a short video snippet and you should automatically recognize what kind of action is going on. This is from the UCF sports data set. The limitation here is that really the focus is just giving one label to the whole video, but I think if we want to have robots that can interact with people, we need a much better, finer-grained understanding of what's going on in a video. So for example, here you might be able to say the person is kicking a ball without even seeing a ball, right? But we as roboticists, we really want to have a much more detailed understanding. And that brings me to this kind of 100-100 tracking challenge, where the idea is here's a video taken with 3 depth cameras of a person doing a protocol in a Wetlab. Now imagine in such a setting, we know the environment, and we can imagine a robot working, for example, in your home in the kitchen. It also knows the kitchen after a while. It has depth cameras to observe what's going on. You might even have 3D models of the objects, and you might know the people you're interacting with. And the main goal now is, can we really analyze such a video to the level such that we can say we can identify every single pixel in every single frame and tell you what object is involved, what activity is being performed, and for example, what is the articulation of the person in that scene. So that would be the ultimate goal, really having robots that can analyze very fine-grained of what's going on around them. In order to move towards this challenge, there are kind of 3 questions that we have to look at. One is on modeling scenes. The first thing, you need to get a model of the scene and the environment. The next one is then, once you have models, you would like to be able to track what's going on in the scene in real time, track the objects, track the people. And finally, of course, an important part is to initialize those trackers. An important component is what we call object detection, and I'll talk about that in the last section, and then I'll conclude with a discussion. But let me start with the modeling part. There's, of course, with these depth cameras, there's been a huge amount of work on 3D mapping, and my student Peter Henry has done some early work in this, using these depth cameras where you combine the color and the depth information to come up with actually pretty nice, dense 3D models of environment. Here's a model that you built by just walking through a bay in the in the Wetlab and get a pretty nice 3D colored model out of this. You can see at the same time that there's still quite some limitations. So in the upper left-hand side, there are these kind of plastic bottles, and because they're transparent, so we can't really get a very good 3D model out of them. But on the other hand, you can see already that we're getting pretty good 3D models of environments. Now, in addition to just getting model of the environment, you might want to think about modeling also the objects. And the techniques underlying object modeling are very similar to just modeling an environment, because we assume that the object is just not is a rigid object. Some early work that my student Mike Cranin did there was actually enabling a robot to pick up an object and then track the object as it's moving it in front of its own camera in order to autonomously build a 3D model of the object. Okay, and the exploration of the object is kind of driven by a next best view uncertainty minimization idea, where the notion is we build a 3D model of the object, and we also have a notion of uncertainty in the surface, and the robot moves the object in front of its own camera so that it can minimize the uncertainty in the 3D shape of the object. And then ultimately, even because it has these occlusions where it's picking up the object, it can put down the object on the table and then grasp it from a different location to build a complete object model. So now we're really at the level, I think, where maybe not autonomously, but even with KinectFusion style mapping, get pretty good models of 3D objects. Now the thing gets trickier if we want to build models of people. And here we're really building on the KinectFusion system that Richard Newcomb developed. I'm sure many of you have heard of KinectFusion, where the idea is that the model of the environment is a very fine-grained 3D voxel grid. And in each of these voxels in the 3D space, you're not only storing whether it's free space or obstacle, but you are storing a so-called signed distance function, which tells you how far in front or behind a certain voxel is from a measured surface. Okay, and it turns out that these representations are extremely good for building these fine-grained 3D models like the one I showed you, for example, of the Wetlab earlier. One problem is that the underlying assumption, as it is for most of the mapping techniques, is actually that the scene doesn't change during the mapping process. Now, if you want to build maps of people or models of people, then a problem is that they might be moving while you're modeling them. And here's an example of kind of Richard building a model of himself while moving his head. And you can clearly see that that's not a very accurate model of him, because what the mapping system does is just kind of averaging over the data, because it assumes the scene is rigid, and the only thing that's moving is the camera. So what you would get out of this is such a kind of pretty useless model. And especially if you imagine also building models of children or things like that, they're not going to stand still. So we had to come up with a technique of trying to model people, for example, while they are moving. And that brought up this new technique that Richard developed while he was a postdoc with Steve Seitz and me at UW, which is called DynamicFusion. And the idea here is that we're building a non-rigid model of a person as the person is moving. So what you see in the left is kind of an outside view on the setting. So there's a depth camera sitting on the laptop looking at Jessica in this case. Upper right portion, you can see the raw depth image that the camera is seeing. And on the lower right, the important part is what we show you is the model that is being built projected back into the live data. So you can see that the model of her is becoming more and more complete, and at the same time also we are able to really accurately project it back into the live data so that the mapping process itself is actually working pretty well. And an important aspect of this work was really that we can do this in real time, and this is shown here because the video laptop actually shows the mapping process in real time. Okay? So we can do this at 30 frames a second, updating this model. And the key trick compared to KinectFusion is that we're not only building a rigid model of the person, surprisingly actually we're building a rigid model of the person, but along with this model, we're also estimating what's called a volumetric motion field, which means for every point in the 3D volume of that model, we are estimating how that point should move such that it tracks the real live data that we see. Here you can just see one slice of this volumetric motion field on the left side. So on the left side you see a static model, and on the right side you see a warped model that we can get through this motion field. So you can see these 3D vectors moving in the space, and this is just one slice, and we're estimating this actually through the 3D volumetric space, and we can model this way actually a pretty wide range of motion and deformations, and that is why the mapping actually works, because we do this in real time as we're doing the mapping. Because otherwise you couldn't build a consistent model of the person. Let me just give you one more example here. Is a scene, look at, especially at the cup, where the model is becoming more and more complete because things get out of these occlusion ranges. You look at the lid up there of the cup, that now, over time, actually, we're getting a complete model of that. Okay, so now where we are is we can build models of environments, of objects, and of people. And the next question is, in real time, we would like to be able to track things as they are moving through the scene. And that brings me to the second topic, which is on tracking what we call articulated scenes. And here, my student Tanner has done a lot of work in the framework we call DART, Dense Articulated Real-Time Tracking. And the idea is that we represent an articulated model by pieces of signed distance functions, which means pieces of KinectFusion maps, if you think so. Okay, and these different pieces are then stacked together through an articulation, which represents kind of the motion relative to these. So you can imagine this could be a whole body. This could be, it's a Baxter robot, a human hand, or even furniture like drawers opening or closing can be modeled in this framework. And again, now the notion is what we want to do is we want to track these objects as they are deforming in the scene. Let me just give you one example of, this is a manipulator picking up an object, a block, okay? And now imagine you have a depth camera and you look at that scene, so you will see these black dots coming up. These are the observed dots of the depth camera, let's say. So now you have the model in gray and the dots in black. And the goal is you can see this mismatch between those, and what we want to do in tracking is, of course, we want to match the data against the model. And with the signed distance functions, we can very, very quickly compute for all these black points. We can compute through these SDF signed distance fields, we can very quickly compute the distance of all the observed points to our model, and then we can optimize the model pose so as to minimize this. So this is a version of this articulated ICP, but using these signed distance functions for very rapid lookup of these distance fields. The interesting part is using a real volumetric model of the object is also that we can add physical constraints into the optimization process. So imagine this robot here, for example, has touch sensors, and it detected that these two fingers are in contact with the object. We can also model that through the signed distance function, and now in the optimization, make sure that the fingers are actually touching the object. Okay, this just becomes one component of the overall optimization. It's not a separate part. And now look at the two fingers, and you can imagine that they're actually sticking inside each other. So there's some kind of inconsistency here. But using this volumetric representation, we can also detect these inconsistencies and then include them in the optimization such that the fingers are actually consistent as well. So objects don't stick into each other, for example. Okay? So using this model-based approach, we can take all these things into account as we are optimizing over the tracking process. So here's an application for mobile robot manipulator. This was in collaboration with DLR near Munich. What you see in the upper left is kind of the view from the depth camera. In the lower left, you can see the model that is being tracked. So we're doing closed-loop control here. And the important part is that in real time, we're tracking the hand of the robot and the object itself. So we're doing visual servoing here in this sense. Okay? So the nice part is because this is working in real time, the robot can even, for example, in this case, you'll see if the robot drops the object, we are able to detect that in real time and detect the object as it is falling on the table. So you can imagine that's, of course, very useful for the robot to really know what's going on in the scene. Here's another application, exactly the same framework, the same kind of program. Just now we are feeding in a model, for example, of a human hand on the left or on the right side, kind of a human body, and now we can track these in real time as well. Okay? So the nice aspect is, again, the generality that we don't have to use different kind of algorithms for the different kind of settings. And what you see in the left is also, this is kind of the speed at which we can process the data. Okay, so 30 frames a second. So now what you can see is that we are able, again, we can build models of objects and environments. We can track them in real time once the tracker is initialized. You can also see that we could do the same thing with opening and closing doors and things like that. The main problem so far with these kind of model-based trackers is that they need to be initialized, which means you have to have the initial pose of them. And since this is a high-dimensional search space, you can't just initialize them through brute force search. So this is where the next part comes in, which is on detecting articulated objects. And this is a domain clearly where machine learning is very important and actually turns out to be crucial in order to do this, to make these systems much more robust. Here's one work that, for example, my student Daniel Gordon is working on right now, so where you can use a deep neural network. Of course, these days, all the students want to do deep learning. A deep neural network that you can train to go from the input, raw input depth map. You can train a neural network to generate a bounding box of the hand, which means the center of that, and the size. Now you can grab that bounding box and feed the bounding box here on the lower left, feed that through another network that you train to detect individual points on the hand. Okay, so for example, you have a large data set where you label like the fingertips and things like that, these little boxes here, and then we can train a neural network to detect that from the raw depth information. Okay, and here you can see an example of the tracking, where again, in the upper left, you see the input depth map, and in the lower right, you can see the articulated hand being tracked through these little boxes. An interesting aspect here is actually that the network also learned, for example, when you see the hand from here, from your viewpoint, and you see the hand, the neural network is even able to predict kind of 3D poses for my pointer, even though it's occluded by the data. So the network inherently also learns, for example, a kind of articulation model of the hand itself. Okay? And this is not tracking through time. This is every single frame is viewed from scratch without history, right? Just to show kind of the robustness of this. What you can also do then with this kind of data, you can match a Dart model. If you have an articulated model of the hand, you can match it against these 3D detected points and then do tracking of this articulated model, which might enable you to also incorporate kind of 3D constraints and things like that. So far what we assume is that we have a training data where someone really labeled these individual points for every frame. In a different line of work, student Tanner is looking at how can we learn dense data association in a fully unsupervised way. So the notion is, instead of detecting individual points on a hand, for example, we would like to be able to detect any single point, any single surface point on the object model. And what he's doing there is leveraging kind of the modeling power of DynamicFusion. So imagine on the upper left, you can see a DynamicFusion model of Tanner being built from the video that you see here on the right, or that you see an image of it right now. And what we can do with this data now is, without any manual labeling, we can pick any point on the object model. so in this case, the kind of the blue dot on the forehead, and we can go to the video data, and we can label that point throughout the data at the pixel level. Okay, so we can tell you for every video frame which pixel was looking at this point on the model. Now, the trick is we can train a neural network such that image patches that look at the same point are mapped to a feature space or an embedding space that maps them nearby, and image patches that look at different pixels that they are mapped apart from each other. Now, you can use this embedding for data association. Okay, so what you can do then is, for example, you can take a model from one scene and look at an image from another scene, and for every pixel you can compute this embedded space, and in the embedded space you compute a distance function based on which you can do the data association. And we can use this now to kind of transfer DynamicFusion models across scenes. So on the left you see always kind of the scene where the DynamicFusion model came from, and on the right you can see how we match it into the scene. And this is done in a two-stage process, using only color information. So in the first stage, there's no depth information that's even being used. So you can see across like drastically different lighting conditions, the process is actually very robust in matching from one scene to the other, because the embedding was trained to be invariant to lighting condition changes and also invariant even to kind of changes in the shape of the body. We can apply the same notion also to kind of initializing, for example, hand pose tracking. So this is very much ongoing work that Aaron is looking at right now. On the left, in gray, you see always kind of the depth map, and in black, you see the model. The red lines were the data association that the learning gave us, and now we can optimize this model into the scene in this kind of globally consistent way. Okay, and now you can see that we can also initialize these models. And again, the really important part of that piece of work is that it is fully unsupervised. Okay, all the feature learning is done just based on the DynamicFusion training data that we are getting. So now I would like to conclude with a brief discussion. I believe that the ability, if we are able to look at depth videos, for example, a robot, and can analyze the scene and can explain every single motion, any single activity going on in that at a very fine granularity, then this will really enable robots with collaboration capabilities and manipulation capabilities that's far beyond what we can do right now. So I think this can be the basis really for a lot of future work also in human-robot interaction. We've seen, so our lab and the community at large has really made a lot of progress on tracking objects and tracking scenes. Some really open problems in this domain are how can we track objects that are being manipulated? So for example, while it's in my hand, there are all these occlusions going on. And especially if I have very small objects, so in this Wetlab that we're looking at, the objects are very small and many transparent objects. So the question is, how do you model and track those? It's still not sufficiently well solved, I would say. Also rapid online learning of new objects. So I show you an object once and you should be able to track it. Tracking stuff is actually really exciting, which means how do you track, if I'm chopping an onion, how do you track the onion? What is even the representation for an onion, or water and things like that? These are new domains we are really looking at. And how do you go from the low-level tracking also to a bit higher-level activities? So let me just briefly show you one early example we did a while ago on tracking cooking activities, where all we do is we detect the objects being put on the table, we're tracking the hand, and then we are able to extract what you can see here on the lower hand. We can track how the person is going through the recipe and performing different steps in that. Okay, and you can imagine something like this, of course, applies to many different settings, for example, in manufacturing, in these Wetlab environments, where the robot needs to be able to really at a fine level track the kind of activity that's going on and how objects are being moved. But this is still very early work. One very last thing, if I have the time, one exciting direction we're moving into is actually detecting water. So you imagine like robots should be able to pour you a glass of water or a half glass of water. And I believe if we want to do a good job of that, we must be able to actually detect the water in the video data. Okay, and here's some early work where we're actually using also, again, deep learning to use data like the one on the left, which is actually artificially rendered water because we can easily label the ground truth. And on the right-hand side, you can see the neural network how it's actually detecting the water, okay? And this is a neural network that also has some memory nodes in them to remember things over time. So this is a current direction of the research we're also going in. And with that, I'd like to, of course, thank the great students and collaborators I was happy enough to work with, and I'm open for a question if we have time. Thank you.